And now, our feature presentation.
This is episode 39 of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm Jeff Kaiser. It is August 19th, 2022. Super excited about this episode. It's been about a month plus in the works. Really cool thing happening in Orlando at the Orange County Regional History Center. That's going to be a big chunk of our interview today. I have on with me two guests, Jim Faherty, who is a longtime promoter in the Orlando area, and also the figurehead of Figurehead. Lots of great releases on Figurehead. And we also have on the assistant curator at the Orange County Regional History Center, Jeremy Hileman. Welcome on in. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Doing awesome.
Yeah, doing great. Thanks for having us.
I am assuming that you are both on location at the museum itself.
That is correct. Yeah, we are here at the Orange County Regional History Center. Jim, we have a meeting later today as well. So Jim thought he would just come in and we'd do this together.
You know, now that COVID has finally started to kind of move away from our day-to-day, yes, it still exists, but it's not like it was when the pandemic first started. How have things been going since things have started to kind of resume back to normal?
Well, I mean, from the museum's perspective, we're, operating as normal for the most part. I mean, we're doing our events and our exhibitions, as scheduled. We did have a brief period of time kind of towards the beginning of COVID where we closed for a while. And then we ended up doing one of our planned special exhibitions completely online. But since then, we've had a few in person, and we're kind of back on that normal rotation now. And I know from a music perspective and from just an events perspective, things have changed quite a bit. Hopefully getting back to normal, but Jim's still kind of in that world, so I don't know how much that's influenced your kind of current business, Jim.
Post-COVID, during the COVID, we were doing sporadic shows based on the guidelines, but we were doing about 100 shows a year and cut back to doing about 5 shows a year. So it's been, we're ramping back up. The next year is going to be, the end of this year is going to be huge. So
the opening of the Figurehead Music and Mayhem exhibition is September 10th. Man, that's not that far off. So it's less than a month away. So can you talk a little bit about some of the origins of putting this exhibition together? I know this is not an overnight thing. This has been something that I'm sure has been thought of and curated in its own way for probably quite a while. So can you tell us kind of where this kind of comes from and why now for this exhibition?
Well, from my perspective, I met Jim close to 3 years ago now. And kind of the original reason that we reached out to Jim was in the late 90s, early 2000s, Jim ran a club called Dante's on South Orange, which that building later became Pulse Nightclub. And here at the History Center, we have our One Orlando collection, which is our items related to the Pulse Nightclub shooting. So each year for the first 5 years following the tragedy, we would do a special exhibition kind of in remembrance of that. And one of the projects that we were working on involved kind of the history of the Pulse building and the different businesses that had been prior. So I had seen some information about Jim's involvement with Dante's, and I recognized that, he had been involved in so many other things here locally, primarily in the music business. And that was an interest of mine. So I really thought it would be cool to have him in to do an oral history here. One, as part of that project related to Pulse, but also just to kind of get his take on, his experiences here locally, because we do oral histories here. That's a big part of our collecting effort, to sort of, speak to people about their lives here in Central Florida. So, some of the cool things that they've been involved in, but also just the sort of everyday experiences of the local community members. So Jim came in and had a lot of great information about Dante's and kind of, his experiences there. But a lot of our conversation kind of turned to his experience promoting shows here locally. So myself and our now director, Pam Schwartz, had originally interviewed him. And we, kind of developed a relationship, and he showed us some of the items that he had. And of course, we were interested in acquiring that for our permanent collection, and it kind of just grew from there. But after a while, when we realized just the amount of stuff that he was willing to, donate to us, we thought it would be really cool to kind of put together some way to show this off and kind of, represent the really cool, time that his career and his collection represents. But yeah, it's kind of morphed into way more than we originally intended, and I think it's something that's really cool. Like, originally a lot of the discussion was like, we have these great posters, let's put them up and let's do an exhibit out of that. And I think it's morphed into something a lot more than that. We're telling the story of this sort of snapshot of the Central Florida music scene. And
Yep.
I know that that's such a lofty topic that you can't really encapsulate a music scene in a city, in any, fair amount of time or any exhibit space. But I think that this is a good start. And I think that, it's something that's underrepresented in our collection. We had some music stuff, but I think that for the most part, the 80s and 90s, what this, collection really represents is a really special time here in Orlando. And I think that, it speaks to a lot of cool creative efforts, and that Jim was a part of at that time. So we're really excited about it. We've been able to interview a lot of really cool designers and musicians and people involved in the music scene. So we hope that people really like it.
Wonderful, Jeremy. And Jim, question for you. What was your reaction when the History Center wanted to do something like this?
I was completely blown away, because it was perfect timing, and probably not the perfect timing for Jeremy of what I dumped off to him, because I was in a process of after opening my last bar, Bullet Bar downtown. I had all this literally 3 truckloads of memorabilia loaded up, and figuring out what am I going to do with it. And Jeremy just perfectly asked me, like, can you donate some stuff? And I remember pulling in, backing up, and just kept dumping milk crates and wine boxes, and it was beyond of what I gave him. And I'm like, I don't really care if you guys want to burn it or do whatever you want, but if you guys want to figure out something. And it was like awesome, because it just never stopped, and he never said no, so I just kept bringing it. It was kind of hysterical, by the way.
Yeah.
Because I really don't think they had any. I think they thought I was going to drop off like a box of like 10 posters. They didn't realize I did like over 5,000 concerts. So
besides posters, what other kinds of items did you donate?
Ticket stubs and random photographs, I don't even know. I mean, honestly, it was bizarre. It was so much stuff, and it was mostly posters and flyers. People didn't understand how we did flyers before. There was colored flyers and Kinkos, and I was methodically keeping everything in these books of like early 80s punk rock flyers, because everything was black and white and Kinkos, Duke the Guy Kinkos, and like, here's 2 Black Flag tickets and print me 100 flyers. He goes, no problem, dude. You got it, midnight, So it was a lot of that, and I kept all that. So a really bad hoarder.
We also got the pretty much the entire discography of Figurehead records as well. So that that's a pretty cool part of it as well. And we'll, that'll be on display as part of the exhibit also.
And which I never realized how many releases I actually did. So it was kind of exciting to see that, because everything was on the seat of our pants back then. So
right. Yeah, there definitely are quite a number of releases. I think 20, 25 or something, or something.
I thought there
like
was
that.
5. So that
Oh, no. Definitely more than that.
Yeah,
So-
definitely was more.
So, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of the music on the label because that's important. I know it wasn't just a Florida label, but definitely there were a lot of Florida bands that were on that label, of course. Besides yourself, Jeremy, and of course you, Jim, what other people have been involved at putting this together and getting it ready for its launch in September?
Well, that's that's a big question.
That for Jeremy, that's a loaded question because he did so much work of tracking down all of, I call the conspirators that helped me out, of so many people to pull off one show of like, we had no security, we had no internet, we had nothing. So Jeremy just really, really forensic file, tracked down all the people. It was amazing.
And I want to note, here at the History Center, our staff, we really work to, make it as something as, as special as we can. And everybody who works at the museum here has a hand in the special exhibits, in some way, shape, or form, from our, programming standpoint to events to education, doing things here. And then obviously our exhibits department has really been, the push behind this. I think, I've been very lucky to be the, kind of point person with Jim and get to, do a lot of the research and kind of handling that end of it. But I think the look of it and the sort of physical construction of the exhibit and that kind of direction, I think our exhibits team has done a pretty amazing job of making this something special, just because a lot of it is so geared towards the, the design world and the fact that, these posters are a really important part of the story. So I think it would really be an injustice to have, just something slapped up on the wall. So we really wanted to kind of make it something, unique and cool and something that people kind of walk away thinking, wow, that was really worth coming to.
And Jim, based on that, was there anything in the collection that for whatever reason got lost to the ether of time? You don't have it. You wish you still did. You wish it was a part of this collection. Does anything like that still haunt you that you wish you had that you just...
I don't know if Jeremy found it, but the original, which I don't have a copy of it, and I think Jeremy maybe got a copy of it, was the original Dead Kennedys poster at the Serenades Lebanese Hall from Thomas Scott. And it was a ripoff of the Aerosmith's first album cover. And it was hysterical. I have a partial of it, but I was really good about keeping everything. But so many of these hardcore like punk shows early on, I really didn't have any money to even make more than like 10 copies of a flyer, So that was one of my favorite posters, but I don't have a copy of it.
We do have it. We have it on loan. For some of the flyers we have done like on kind of a bigger scale. So we got that, on loan to be able to kind of make a big replica of it for the exhibit. But that's how we're kind of kicking off the sort of narrative of the exhibit, is the story of when the Dead Kennedys played in Orlando for Jim and for Figurehead. And I think that's a good way to kind of convey that the idea, because the exhibit's called Music and Mayhem. So I for those who are completely unfamiliar with this, I think that'll be a good sort of introduction to that world.
After that show, I should have stopped doing shows, and that was 1986 or 85. So after that show I should have quit.
I'm pretty sure I read an interview that you'd done back then, I think to maybe the Orlando Sentinel, where you brought that up, that should have been your first and your last show.
It was pretty horrific.
What was one of the things that you can share that happened that made it such like a legendary show?
Well, because, when I moved here from Pittsburgh, when we did shows like that up there, when I was in high school and college, Pittsburgh was the epicenter of like Cleveland. The most you would get at a show like that was 200 people. And when I did Black Flag on Super Bowl Sunday, I thought I would get 200 people. And I kept telling Henry Rollins, maybe 300 people, because it was Super Bowl Sunday. And it's the only day they could do. Like, I go, guys, how do you expect me to get people to come out on the biggest sports event of the year? And they're like, that's the only day we have, because back then they only had so many days you could just tour. They were touring every single day. And that show should have warned me that we had like close to 2,000, and it was Mayhem. And then right after that, I did the Dead Kennedys. and I couldn't find a place to do it. And I rented Syrianese Lebanese Hall under the guise that I was doing a friends of mine's 16th birthday party. That went really south from that lie. That place hold maybe 800 people, and like 2,000 people showed up.
Wow.
It was bad. It was very, very bad. There was no stage. It was like 6 inches off the ground. You couldn't even hear the sound. And Jello was hysterical because Jello, the whole show was mayhem. From start to finish. Like the icing on the cake was sitting there crying and watching someone carry the kitchen sink out of the venue. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. It was like an anomaly of like, this is unbelievable.
And that does sound like mayhem.
It was mayhem.
How did that follow you reputation wise after a show like that?
The Syrianese Lebanese community was not very happy. And I paid all the damages to the teeth. I paid every dime. And it didn't reflect anything because people are so starving for music. You just kept finding different venues. So it didn't deter 1 inch from me doing shows. So you learn from your mistakes, you know.
So when you came to the Orlando area, we're talking, this was 1983, is that right?
Yeah, when I graduated, I was 21. I graduated college, yeah. My dad's buddy, this nightclub in the South called JJ Whispers. When I graduated hotel restaurant management, they tricked me into coming down here to help them out, open it up, because I did not want to come to Florida. To go down there for 6 months, help them open up. I never left.
What was the scene like when you arrived?
The reason I'm going to come down to Orlando, because all you think about is Disney. I was actually sticker shocked. The first thing I did was I went to the Yellow Pages and I looked up every record store. It was Armadillo Records. I don't think Rax Tree was open then. It was Murmur Records and East West. Yeah, with Hannah. Yeah, they were open. Yeah. And I would go to the record stores and just start talking to the owners about like what the music scene was like. And when I met Don Gilliland from Murmur, him and this guy, Ed Puglisi, were the music promoters, trying to do shows, just trying to do anything like Love Tractor. Don had booked the Replacements on Edgewater Drive, American Vet Club, you know. That's what you would rent out back then. And it was just always so much trauma. So Don and Ed, I partnered with Ed, but Don just like passed the torch and said, hey, I own the record store. I hope you promote it, but I don't want to do it. So, and I was 21 and dumb, and you know, I already been doing it all since high school and through college. So I was a seasoned veteran of promoting shows, just not on the level of how many people would show up down here. But the scene was great. I mean, there was a lot of local cool bands and cool venues. It was very cool.
Who were some of the bands you remember from that period that stand out to you?
One of the first bands was King Cowboy. Downtown Orlando was Park Avenue. There was no downtown Orlando. So Park Avenue had this club called Decades, and that's where the bands would play. And immediately when I first got it, then I met like Michael McCraney, and all these guys are still in high school. David Minshew and Ken Chinini. And Ken Chinini had this band called Green Today. And me and Thomas Scott, who did the Figurehead label and all the artwork, we just started digging into the trenches of the local bands. And it was a cool scene. It was just a lot of, the minute I started booking, when I first got here, right, immediately, we were using the local bands, Sinful Pigeons, which was Jeff Nolan's band, and they already had a very healthy scene. Jangle, REM, Birds Driven, of that, there was a big vibe of REM was like the rage of Central Florida at the time.
I remember one of the first releases that compiled a lot of different bands of the era from Orlando that you put out on the Figurehead label was The Vessels Had Life, which came out in 1987. A lot of those bands that are on there, with the exception of a few, never really had much output. Those
I don't
bands,
think any of them had any output.
yeah. So how did you decide which bands you wanted to kind of put out on that first compilation on the label?
It was the bands I was working with. It was Bad Afro Experience, and you got to remember every band member was helping me do the show. Like when we did Figurehead Night Out #1, it was all the bands like loaning the equipment and it was a collaborative effort. Like I can't even tell you. Every show, people were volunteering for security, volunteering to run the door. Below Zero, Barbarella, which was Beach Club back then. Every show, the guys from Noise for the Needy, which Ed Puglisi's band was a big band back then. Every one of those guys, Dino, everybody jumped in because everybody wanted to see it happen. And everybody's trying to get bigger bands to come to Florida because the bigger bands would go to Atlanta, then go to New Orleans. They didn't want to come down to Florida. Too much money, too much time. So from the help with all these connections with these other cities, we started offering these bands, say, hey, come down and do Jacksonville Beach, Einstein a Go-Go, our club, Tampa, and go out to Pensacola at Sluggos. So we offer them 4 dates together as a team, just to try to get these bands, because no national acts or whatever back the punk scene would come to Florida, except for if you're from Athens, Georgia, or Florida punk band, 1985, I was managing this place called Sleep Out Louie's. So I just put every band, Husker Du, Marginal Man, Meat Puppets, all into the venue that I had.
While you were putting some of these shows together, what was the reaction like from the people that were going to these shows? Considering probably some of these bands may not have ever played Orlando before, or may never even played Florida before.
Well, that's what made our reputation huge, is because these bands are so used to going into to me, what I call industrial cities, Cleveland, Cincinnati, the East Coast, and there's 200 people. They're
Right.
coming down here and there's 2,000 people or 1,500 people. It was insane. But then, like when we were doing stuff at Faith and Physics with John Gartner, like Suicidal Tendencies or 10,000 Maniacs, the club could only hold 300 people. But the thing back then, because it was pre-internet, it was a tribe. People just came out if it sounded alternative. So there was no like, oh, only the punk kids came out for this show, or the same people that came out for Suicidal Tendencies were coming out to see 10,000 Maniacs because you wanted to be part of that scene. So it didn't matter. So that's the beauty before the internet, that people were just coming out for the shows and supporting them. All the shows, even local shows, were insanely packed, which was very exciting for the bands and for the vibe of the crowd, because there's no prejudgmental of, Road Shadows was pre-Guns N' Roses, kind of almost metal. And then you had Target Earth that was this, and then East Egg that was this, or Braille Closet was this. So they all came out. It didn't matter.
At the peak of what was going on at this time, can you kind of describe what was a typical day for you?
Well, I ran a manufacturing company from 88 to 2000 called Kilowatt Saver. So I was a suit and tie guy during the day. And then, Batman, go home and put jeans and a t-shirt on and do the shows. That's why I was never married or had kids, because I just worked 7 days a week. But I was in my blood. I loved it. I loved doing the shows, But my day job that I owned paid me very well to support being an idiot doing these shows that I was losing money hand over fist. Because 90% of the shows back then lost a lot of money. Putting out those records lost a lot of money. It was a labor of love.
Of course.
But see, the bands went in, like the festivals had, they made their own recordings. They paid for all that. I didn't pay for that. And they gave me the recordings and we put it out. It wasn't just me. It wasn't like some guru or, Tony Wilson from Factory Records, putting up the money. These guys put up their own money, recorded it, and then I put it out. And then we split. I would do a deal where we handshaked and the money would come back in, would pay for the recording, which was nothing. And then they got the rest of the money. But, back then you weren't selling that much.
Right.
Naomi's Hair did really, really well, and Braille Closet did really, really well.
And speaking of Braille Closet, that's definitely the band that has the most output on the label.
Well, and Michael was like my partner in Figurehead. So them and Naomi's Hair was very part of the Figurehead, family,
Yeah. What were some of their early shows like, Braille Closet? I'm assuming you had a chance to probably see them quite a number of times. So what was some of their shows like back then?
Well, what I loved about them, which was super frustrating, was I was a massive fan. So even back in '88, when I first seen him, and Michael and I were we liked from the Minutemen and we liked the Church. We were all over the board of what kind of music we liked. And it would influence his music, and the guitar player, Michael Schmidt, and Bill Bartling, the bass player. Everybody had these different musical influences. And we got the rights to do a Who's Could Do cover on one of the singles. By the time we would put out the single, they were already tired of that music, and they would play something completely new that they did. I'm like, can you just play one song from the first album? They're like, no, we're not going to promote it, because it took so long to put the album out. They were already even though it took 6 months, they wouldn't even play that music. It was kind of funny and frustrating.
I bet. Jeremy, thinking about some of these bands that we're talking about, how much have you had to kind of go back and hear kind of what the sound was of Figurehead at that time and throughout its legacy?
Yeah, so I've gotten to delve, quite a bit into this music, and I think you're pretty spot on with Braille Closet being the one that kind of pops up the most, definitely in terms of the releases through Figurehead. And, I got a chance to talk to Michael McCraney for this project as well. So that was really great to kind of get his perspective. And then also, just working with Jim through the years at the Sapphire and everything, I think that he's definitely a good resource on that. But it's interesting that you mentioned kind of the sound of it, because like the comp tape that you first mentioned there, the Vessels Have Life, like that is pretty all over the place as far as the style of music. And you can't really like pigeonhole it as one thing. And I think, Jim, even now, but in a lot of our conversations, has described sort of that, for lack of a better term, that kind of REM sound. And I think that you do hear that in some of the music from the Figurehead label. But as far as like Bad Afro Experience is like way different than that. I think like, the Green Today, who's actually going to be playing our opening party for the exhibit, definitely like a different kind of sound. So it's been cool to explore that. And I also think it's cool to speak to some of the musicians that kind of came maybe a little after that, who were inspired by those bands. So like, I got to speak with Jason Ross from Seven Mary 3, and he actually talked about how influential Naomi's Hair was, and how much he really loved that band. So it's cool to kind of see that thread go through. And, I'm sure there are others that could, speak to how, you alluded to a lot of those bands never necessarily did a lot after that, those releases, but it's cool. And that's always, kind of a thing with the, music history, as you see that kind of continue on, even if those bands didn't break out, that one down the road did. That got to kind of experience them. So that's been really cool. It's been a lot of fun to kind of trace that path, that thread all the way through.
The first band that I ever heard who put out anything on Figurehead came later in the early 90s, and that's the Genitortures.
Well, that was probably the most notorious release. And
why is that?
Well, because Jen and I were like dear friend. We've been best friends. We're still best friends. And they were the anomaly of all the other music that I worked with. And they were way on the fringe, but I was really, really into her music. I met her really early on, before she went to Rollins College. And I did a Meat Men show with her at Rollins College. Man, her spirit and her drive to get something out. And if you look at the production and the artwork for that, to put out that artwork of that one, that's silver and black and purple vinyl, it was a labor of love. Jen is still to this day playing, and I love doing shows with her, and I love borderline getting arrested all the time, every time I did a show with her.
I think Jim is kind of right that a lot of that, is kind of on the fringe, that we, we'll definitely, pay tribute to them. But
sure,
we actually are doing an upcoming program about women in the Central Florida scene. So we featured in that as well a little bit.
Another important person who kind of told the story visually on what was happening in the Orlando scene was photographer Jim Leatherman. So getting a chance to, I'm sure, collect some of his photography that he had taken over the years. Any memories working with him and the importance that he played with capturing a lot of that on film?
Jim was one of the first people I met here in the inception. Remember, when you go to Murmur Records, it's almost like a clubhouse. Jim Leatherman worked there, and all the cool kids worked at all the cool record stores in town. So they would give you, like, I'll never forget when Replacements Let It Be, Thomas Scott and Ken Chidini worked at Peaches. We all raced down the Peaches to get Let It Be by the Replacements. So it was this subculture club, and Jim Leatherman was hardcore into it because that guy documented, still to this day, like every show I did, he was there. And the cool thing about it was the style of music he turned me on to, like the Reavers and the Canals and all this kind of Southern music. And then Dave Sonnenberger turned me on to ska, Toasters and Bim Scala Bim and Soul Asylum. And so each person brought to the table, like, this is what I heard, this is what I like. And that's what was really cool about the scene, because the only way you could listen or hear about a new band was someone telling you about it. Like someone saying, oh, I heard this, or I heard that. And so each person brought a new slab to the table that we'd all sit there at the record store and listen to. And it was absolutely amazing. You know, I was there when Murmur released Master of Puppets, and they had a line, 100 kids to buy the cassette. It was insane. Like the metal kids got along with the punk kids. Like we all were like one big tribe.
Yeah.
Like one big tribe of people just thirsty for new music. So that's why back then I benefited from every time we did a show like Die Kreutzen, and no one ever heard of Die Kreutzen, it'd be busy, packed. It was great, you know.
Before we move on, I want to talk about Jim Leatherman also, just because, you know, in the same way that I think the really cool design work for the posters really, you know, kind of exemplify Figurehead. I think, you know, more so than anything else, I think that those, you know, those photos from all those shows that Jim took definitely, you know, represent that. And I think that visual look really, you know, personifies the whole Figurehead sort of scene. And I think that without those photos within our exhibit, I don't think it would be half of what it is. And I, you know, just in terms of working a bit with Jim and getting to know, you know, him a little from this project, you know, he's the nicest, most generous guy. And I think that I would say 95% of the photos in our exhibit come directly from him. And, you know, just the look of them, and he did a really good job of just like capturing the spirit and the energy of what's going on. And I think that, you know, it's hard to take photos at shows, like, you know, the lighting and the movement and everything, but I think that the way that he did it, you know, has this sort of feel and grit to it that really evokes something. And I think that that's a really big part of the exhibit, and a really big part of sort of the memories of Figurehead is his work.
And the band's just loved him. He was part of the bands. He played with Braille Closet. He played bass, and he was at every show. He was so passionate. He was like me. He was in the trenches, but he was the guy who helped me load in the bands. We didn't have roadies back then. We were all doing it ourselves. And him and the Ken Chininis of the world were just MVP players. They just did everything possible to help make the show happen. And it was just 100% not me. I was 5% of a 95% of people volunteering and coming out to make the show happen. That kind of stuff, like we came out of Orlando and we kind of shed that Disney stigma. You know, Jacksonville, Einstein, a Go-Go, Tammy would always serve these amazing, her parents cooked these chicken dinners, and we always showed the bands like an amazing time. We took them out to dinner. We didn't do the catering crap. We made it like an experience that would blow their minds, you know, to entice these other bands in to come down, because they're like, yeah, dude, it's a local scene. They're 30 miles from Disney. It's amazing.
And as you were gathering not just these photographs, but also thinking about some of the things that were written over the years in print, now you can go back and find some of these stories and some of these interviews online. But back then, of course, they didn't exist that way. So thinking about some of the important journalists and the writers and the zines that were putting out interviews and reviews on what was happening in Orlando and the general area at that time, anything stand out? Any individuals come to mind that are important that you wanted to share some memories and stories about?
If it wasn't for Mary Frances at the time was the editor of the calendar section. She's like, Jim, anytime you give me a color photo, even though it was like Indigo Girls, I'll fight to get you on the cover. Like, she was so supportive. And then there was Ink 19. It was amazing underground. All those guys were just a crutch, and they helped support the shows too. They were financially, Tabula Rasa, the original Jam magazine. They put like Lydia Lunch and the Jenna Tortures, all those bands on the cover, Henry Rollins, Sonic Youth. Those were the crutch to make the show successful, of them covering it in the mainstream press, covering something alternative. Back then it was Thomas Duffy, and Thomas went to Billboard, and then Perry Gettleman took over. And Perry was very, very entrenched in the scene of trying to cover as much as possible. And then your Orlando Weekly was massive. And, Billy Maines, the writer, but Orlando Weekly, they came to Orlando at the same time Sapphire opened up, and we were in sync of them covering and being a part of it. Me and from Will's Pub, we would advertise with them when they first started out. And all those were a massive crutch, because everybody every week would go to the center folder of Orlando Weekly and see who's coming up. Remember, we didn't have internet. So if the Orlando Sentinel or Orlando Weekly and Ink 19 did this amazing calendar, and they did a whole calendar of the whole South, because I would drive to Athens, Georgia to see bands. If it wasn't for them, you were done. Forget it. That's why there's so many pieces to the puzzle of all this, because it was the posters, it was the flyers, it was the press. You just did not have the internet. You had to get in your car and drive, and you had to get in your car and talk to people, and you had to get to these little holes and these little communities and get flyers on the telephone poles.
So as the mid 90s, late 90s kind of came, how did that change the way that you did things once the internet started to kind of build and became that outlet that you can now use to promote yourself?
I don't know. I kept to my old roots. Sapphire, we put out 5,000 calendars every month. So we had to get all the bands booked, those calendars printed, folded up, stamped, and put in the mail 4 days before the end of the month. And like Shaney and Michael and me and the whole Rat Pack, it was a labor of love. And that was 10 straight years of hell. We had this big thing about never putting TBA on a date. We tried to book every date, and that was like Michael and Shaney's job. And if not, we would make up something. Reverend Horton Heat listening party, whatever. We would make up, something to make it sure that our calendar didn't say to be announced. I hated that. That's what people understand. It was like so much labor of like,
sure,
that calendar alone, now that I think back, how much work just that was. Then you got the press, and then you got to get the poster out. And then we were doing 10 shows a week. We were doing shows at Visage, Beecham Theater. We were doing Sunset Serenade, which was a jazz series. So we weren't just doing Sapphire either. So at some weeks we were doing 10, 12 shows a week. All those posters, all that press, with a bunch of people that just believed in it. It was a lot of work.
When did you find time to sleep?
Well, that's why I get up at 5 a.m. every day, because I can't sleep. I go to bed at 2, 3 o'clock, and you're up at 5, and you just do what you do, because you get into a system. I cannot sleep past 5 o'clock any day, no matter what. No matter how much Jameson that I would chug, I still can't sleep past 5.
You mentioned Shaney, and she was a partner of yours for quite a while. How did you meet?
She was part of the Beecham Theater original crew. Her and her sister came out from Cleveland, and they were doing all the Beecham Theater stuff like Oz and Rave, and She was an early part of that, and we just bonded over. She was yin, we were yin and yang. She did the creative Sapphire. She ran Sapphire. She came up with the menu, the drinks, the look, the vibe, everything. And me and Michael booked the shows. And I would cook there with, so I did the kitchen, but she was the face of Sapphire Supper Club. And she did all what I call the almost alternative rock stuff. She did a lot of the other cool nights, and she was influential in starting Fat and Jazzy with Michael Donaldson and BMF and all that. And that was her baby. So we worked great because she did one side and I did the other side. And there was a lot of headbutting, but it was all good headbutting.
Did you both share the same passion for music?
Oh God, yes. We would she would turn me on to like Elliott Smith, like when we did that show, and we did the show with Jeff Buckley, and I was doing Flaming Lips at the Edge, and she was doing Jeff Buckley at Sapphire. And I took Wayne from the Flaming Lips. We walked down to see Jeff Buckley because there was like 10 people there. So we did early Flaming Lips show, and then we walked down to see Jeff Buckley.
That was one of the nice things too about down there is everything was relatively close. So
we had Firestone, Portishead, and everything but the girl. We did 1 million shows at Firestone. And so some nights we were doing show at Firestone, and after party like Bauhaus at Sapphire. We were doing shows at Bob Carr. We were doing, it was all relatively. Below Zero was in walking distance. So
out of all these shows you put on at Sapphire, and there were some really great ones. I saw a few shows there. Was there one in particular that stands out to you as just like, which is one of your personal favorite experiences you had a chance to not only maybe promote, but see?
Top 5 would be when we did SYR, which was Sonic Youth. They were touring with Pearl Jam. They were an opening band where they could do a private show, but they couldn't do a public show. And Bootleg TV actually filmed it. And Jim O'Rourke was playing the other guitar player at the time with Sonic Youth. That show was because they could just play. They played their first like 2 albums. They were just off the Richter scale of, it was like a freedom that they weren't obligated to play like a Sonic Youth show. They could play whatever they wanted. It was packed. It was unbelievable. You know, Guided by Voices always was our personal heroes, our personal favorite of all time. They always stayed at my house. It was always like a frat party, a bunch of old guys, that's for sure. John Spencer's Blues Explosion, Jesus Lizard. Every time I did a show with Jesus Lizard with David Yao from the Beach Club days all the way through, he's like my soulmate. Of him and I are split from the same cloth, the same attitude, completely reckless, don't have a governor. Just when the show gets started, it just flies off.
I appreciate you sharing that because I don't think it's any secret on the podcast. I've shared this quite a few times, but the Jesus Lizard is probably my all-time favorite band.
I love reading a story. They were doing this history, and they were asking the band the only time that David Yower passed out on stage. And it was a show I was doing at Beach Club, and he's so little. And he dove into the crowd with his big cowboy boots on. Him and I used to sit in front of Sapphire, and I would get my stupid tennis shoes shined up, and he would get his big cowboy boots shined up. He had this really cool shoe shine place in front of Sapphire. And you get all fired up for the show. And he got thrown back so hard, he landed on his head, and the band, or I did not see him land. And I looked over and he wasn't moving, and he was throwing up. And I ran on stage and I told the bass player, I think he's hurt. And he kept kicking him like from behind. He's like, no, he's fine. And then after like the next song, he just woke up and just jumped up. And I'm like, oh, fuck. It scared the hell out of me. He was unbelievable. David Yao is like still my hero. Just unbelievable. Like their energy. You listen to their album and you don't get it. You got to see, them and John Spencer, Blues Explosion were amazing. No set list. And they just brought it. Like, I love that John Spencer didn't use a set list. He just turned back to the drummer and say a song. I thought that was amazing because it made it like real rock and roll music.
And just very consistent. Anytime you see both those bands play, I feel like you got same energy, no matter if they played 100 shows or 5 shows.
Oh, oh my God. They were just, they brought it. They brought it. To me, one of my biggest highlights ever was just doing Sam Rivers. I mean, seeing Sam Rivers' 17-piece orchestra, I must have did 50 shows with them. It was unbelievable. And it gives me goosebumps every time I think of hanging out with Sam and his wife. And I could not believe they were playing Sapphire. A guy who plays with Miles Davis is playing Little Sapphire Supper Club.
It's amazing. And what was it like for you when you come to realize, all the years the Sapphire Club was bringing these amazing shows and acts to the area? When the last show, you find out this is the last one at the Sapphire. Do you remember what that show was and what you were kind of feeling at that time?
Zero. I don't actually remember the last show. Not that it was hammered or anything. It was such a blurry time when I transitioned out and they transitioned in, because the social and Michael's company and the foundation was already kind of pre-booking, and I was phasing out and they were phasing in. So it wasn't any sad. It was like seamless, because I honestly felt it was a perfect time. I just turned 40, passing the torch to Michael, who busted his ass the previous 10 years. He earned his stripes. He just did everything. And it was a perfect time to let him take over. It was perfect. Shane had already moved to New York. It was a perfect time for me to get out. And then we still kind of did shows together, and I still do shows, but it was just, for me, it was a different era that I was not a big fan of the whole new wave of, I was a jaded, at Blink 182s and the new stuff coming in. I was that old guy going, back in the day, we did Black Flag,
Right.
And I was a jerk, about it. I always look forward. I don't look in the past. Like this whole thing that, Jeremy's put together is absolutely amazing and terrifying, and it's a great obituary. But I have a 13-year-old. I think it's an awesome legacy. They digitalize it. I think it's awesome for all the bands. All these guys that have kids, they could just go on the Orange County History Center and they could relive some of the stuff that we did. I think I was so motivated by that. And that was the pitch that Jeremy gave to me initially, like, we'll digitalize it. We got it. And what am I going to do with it? It's going to in rotten files. Like, I loved it. To me, this whole exhibit is about passing it forward. That's all I think about, is like, it's going to be such a great experience for younger people to maybe take some bits and pieces, because that's what I did from other people in the 70s. What they did, I was influenced by, which I'm not a fan of, not a fan of the music, but the Grateful Dead posters and that kind of, I loved all that kind of legacy.
When someone is experiencing this exhibit, what do you think they're going to walk away with when they really take in what the legacy was of Figurehead and the music scene of that era?
If they take away how hard it was to do shows back then, it was a lot of work. A lot of people, like you touched on the print media. I would go on Rollins College Radio 3 times a month and bring bands on. And Rollins College Radio was huge help for me, massive help. Because I'd bring bands on there all the time, and I was on the radio all the time at Rollins College. And Rollins College and UCF at the time, they were huge supporters.
You got to love college radio and all that it had done for so many of the bands that we love and introducing us to so much great music. Good stuff. So once again, gentlemen, I want to thank you for being such wonderful guests today on the podcast. It's been a pleasure having you on. I always like to allow my guests the opportunity to kind of close out the interview. So I'll turn it over to each of you to go ahead and close us out.
My biggest thing that Jeremy knows that my mantra was, it wasn't me. I was the figurehead, which is funny. That's not what the name is from. Like, I was the curator, but everybody else jumped in and helped, from the Jim Leathermans and Thomas Scott's with the poster, and the original figurehead person that came up with the design. And it's just endless. It really is. It's hard. Like, so many of the sound guys that brought sound, like, I can't even tell you the horror stories of these sound guys dealing with, and we're making lights out of coffee cans.
I'm sure that's an interesting story to hear.
There's a million, because lighting and sound, that was back then,
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity to work on this project. I mean, it's, music is something that I'm very, interested in and passionate about, and kind of getting to see it through not only Jim's eyes, but the whole kind of community that existed at that time, because you do really get this sense that, it was a true community, and these people, all these stories kind of intersect, and you see all the sort of threads through everything. So I'm really glad that we get to tell this story. And I hope that, people who were around at this time that remember this or who like this music will get something out of it, and hope that we, do it justice. But I also think that, Jim kind of talked about the younger people or the next generation. And I think that, even if this isn't necessarily your cup of tea, like, I think it's really inspiring that there was a person and a group of people who, sought to do something that they just wanted to make happen. And I think that whatever your interest is, be it music or any other thing, I think that that's something really cool. And that's something that I've really taken away, just, on this project, is just this really inspiring group of people who, sought to make something cool happen. And I hope that this exhibit is kind of a extension of that in some ways.
See, I never knew